The organization for which I work, Safaria, it's not just online, but I literally have the entire Jewish library in my pocket right now. If some of you saw me over there looking at my phone, I wasn't texting and glancing at things. I was looking at this week's Torah portion and dozens of different commentaries on it. Sefaria, S-E-F-A-R-I-A. Go look. It is the most revolutionary thing to Jewish culture since the printing press. And it's pretty amazing. And so the ideas that I'm going to share with you today, you can actually go and explore more if it's interesting to you on that resource and much more. So it's strange and fun to be here in this space. And I'm really honored to be invited, thank you, to speak about a day that is, I think, really interesting. It's certainly dear to my heart. And just with a show of hands, how many of you have heard of Tu B'Shvat? I don't care if you know what it is that you've heard of, but just have you heard the words Tu B'Shvat? And if I were to say how many of you have heard the words Tu B'Nisan or Tu B'Tishrei? You got one, right? You got one all the way in the back, not in the room. Why are you out there? Someone want to guess what Tu B'Nisan is?
Nisan is a month.
Nisan is a month. Anyone know what happens in the Jewish calendar in the month of Nisan? Shout it out. No, in Nisan. In the month of Nisan, there's a very popular
Passover.
Passover happens during what part of the month of the Jewish calendar? The beginning, the end, the middle, and how would you know? When does a Jewish month begin? With the moon. So if it's a new moon, then it is the end or beginning of a month. It's the beginning of a month, right? So if it's the end of the moon cycle, it's the end of the month. So if it's the middle of the moon cycle, it's the middle of the month. So if you've ever looked up in the sky before or after your Passover Seder, you might have seen a full moon. Passover always happens in conjunction with the full moon before the spring equinox, always. So, Tu, in this context, is the Hebrew letter Tet and Vav, which when you add them together as numbers equals 15. Every Hebrew letter is a number. The first 10 letters, 1 to 10. The 11th letter to the 19th letter, 20 through 100, and then the last letters, 100, 200, 300, 400. We, because of religious reasons of not wanting to write or use God's name, don't use the number 5 and the number 10, which would be Yud and Hey, the first two letters of God's name. So we go to the letters before and after, and we take 9 and 6. I don't have to tell you that Jews are strange. We take 9 and 6 and we add that together. And so when we refer to Tu B'Shvat, what we're really talking about is the 15th day of the month of Shabbat, which in the Jewish calendar happens on Monday. But we actually talk about Tu B'Nisan all the time. The 15th of Nisan is arguably the most important day in the Jewish calendar. It's Passover. The whole story is all about that day, and it is the most commonly practiced Jewish ritual, not just from Jews, but for non-Jews. Globally, Passover Seder is the #1 experienced Jewish ritual. And we have other Seders. We have a Seder for Rosh Hashanah. Has anyone ever done a Rosh Hashanah Seder where you eat symbolic foods like carrots, and you eat a carrot, being the word for carrot in Hebrew is gezer, and so you say that this carrot should be for gezerah tovah, good decree. It's a play on words. Right? So there's a Rosh Hashanah Seder. And there's also a Tu B'Shvat Seder. The Tu B'Shvat Seder is very much based on the Tu B'Nisan Seder, the Seder that's connected with the 15th of the month of Nisan, which is Passover. Now, on the other side of the year, 6 months before, 6 months later, depending on how you count, is Sukkot, which happens on the 15th for 1 week, just like Passover, at the full moon before the fall equinox. Right? So Passover on one end of the year, Sukkot on the other end of the year, both on full moons. This will all make sense and be relevant to trees in a moment.
Lady.
So when I ask you when is the Jewish New Year, you're all going to tell me. And if I ask you when Rosh Hashanah is, what season, you would tell me. But what if I told you that Rosh Hashanah was actually in the spring? And the fall. And we also have two others. Because the truth is that in Jewish timekeeping, we have 4 separate New Years. This is not strange. We all live on multiple calendars all the time. Any teachers in the room? Retired or otherwise? More hands go up. Right? You've been living on multiple calendars for your entire career in life, and I'm assuming those retired teachers probably still somewhere in your brain are living on a semester schedule, even though you're no longer in a classroom, right? If you're a baseball fan, I promise you, you know when opening day is. That is a calendar by which you live your life. We live by fiscal years. We live by all sorts of calendars all the time. And in the Jewish timekeeping tradition, we have a calendar for counting years. That is the Rosh Hashanah that we're all familiar with. That happens in the autumn. And our calendar begins in the spring. Jews are April Fools. The origin of the term April Fools comes to the shift to celebrating New Year's in the winter, which makes 0 sense, as opposed to all of human history in the Northern Hemisphere before that, when we celebrated the New Year in the spring, when life comes back, which makes perfect sense. After that shift, anybody who continued to celebrate the New Year in the spring was dubbed an April Fool. Jews are April Fools. The first day of the year in the Jewish calendar is the first day of the month of Nisan. Okay, now that we all understand that. Our ancestors had a complex system of mutual aid to redistribute food resources and other commodities to ensure that acute poverty was a temporary experience in our societies. And one of the primary mechanisms to do this was tithing. Tithing was not a religious tax that the priests corrupted to get more food and be better off. That's often how I think, especially those of us that are secularly minded, think of a practice like tithing. It's not actually what it was. It was a tax that was distributed to people who did not have access to land, so they could not grow their own food. So those who did have access to land contributed a certain percentage of their produce to the community. Now, just like we calculate our taxes based on a deadline, and we have a date by which we must submit our taxes for the previous year, our ancestors had a system of taxation for food redistribution that relied upon a certain calendar that was known as the New Year of the Trees. Any fruit that was fed by the waters that primarily fell before the 15th of the month of Shabbat were taxed for tithing on the previous year. And anything that would receive its rainfall and mature after the 15th of Shabbat would be taxed for the following year. Tu B'Shvat, in its origin, is a tax day. Now, over time, people developed in the 19th century the practice of planting trees, which when you really think about it is especially strange because you're just setting yourself up to pay more taxes in the future. How did we go from a tax day to an Arbor Day? And the answer is actually in Nebraska, that when Arbor Day actually started, there was a Jewish reporter there from a Hebrew language, Haskalah, Jewish Enlightenment newspaper, a secular newspaper from St. Petersburg, and he wrote an article about the first Arbor Day. Another Jew in Ukraine, a guy named Chaim Aryeh, or maybe it's Aryeh Chaim, I always forget, Zuta, read this article and thought, this is the coolest idea ever. And he's the one who decided he was going to take his Hebrew school students and plant trees on Tu B'Shvat. That was in 1904. What happened to Tu B'Shvat between then and the first century when it was a tax day? Was a lot of nothing. It was a completely irrelevant day as soon as that system of tithes went away, when the temple was destroyed, and eventually some people in the rabbinic community were still practicing tithes for spiritual reasons, but by and large the practice faded away. By the 4th century it was gone. In the 16th century, in the mystic community, in the community of mystics in the city of Sfat in northern Israel, developed a practice of this Tu B'Shvat Seder, where different types of fruits were consumed with 4 different cups of wine, so taken from the Passover Seder. And it was turned into a mystical experience whereby, through this somatic meditation of consuming different kinds of fruits, the participant would meditate on different aspects of God and different aspects of our experience in creation. And this was a thing that they did that I am going to guess in the 16th century, in the land of Israel, and with the places where in the Ottoman Empire where their students were, most people would have looked at this practice and thought, y'all are nuts. I didn't even realize the pun that I just made. Right? They would have thought, you're completely crazy. This was a fringe community doing a fringe practice that eventually got written down in a book that explains this whole process. And then in the 20th century, when Kabbalah became this popular thing because of Madonna, y'all remember that, when Madonna got really into Kabbalah and it was all over the news, and all of a sudden everyone wanted to learn it, and the Tu B'Shvat Seder became this super popular thing among Jews throughout the world. And over time, in the last 30 years or so, the bringing together of the Arbor Day Tu B'Shvat that starts with this Ukrainian Jew who winds up making Aliyah and developing that practice of planting trees on Tu B'Shvat spread throughout the entire pre-state of Israel and continues to this day. Right? Anyone ever plant trees in Israel specifically in honor of Tu B'Shvat? Right? It's a thing. So the story to me of how we keep this day relevant and alive is one of the most beautiful and interesting parts of how it is that Jewish culture adapts and evolves, and is so much larger than any of the religious containers that it might have once sprouted out of. Right? That just by virtue of our own contributions to understanding how we maintain these things as meaningful in our lives reminds me of a really beautiful midrash on this week's Torah portion, which I like to share in secular settings because religious people don't always get rabbinic interpretation, because they have this idea that our ancestors read these stories literally. Let me give you a little hint that they definitely did not. So in this week's Torah portion, Parashat Bashalach, which has the story of the splitting of the sea, before the people make their way out of Egypt, it says that Moses took the bones of Joseph, who made everyone promise that they weren't going to let his bones stay in Egypt, and they were going to take him out. Now, I don't know if you ever thought about how many generations there are between Joseph and Moses in that story, but it's a lot. How did they know where Joseph's bones were? Right? So it turns out that the daughter of Asher, as in the tribe of Asher, the chieftain of the tribe of Asher, Asher had a daughter, and her name was Serach, and she was immortal. How do we know she was immortal? Because she shows up in the census when they are leaving, or when they enter into Egypt, and then she shows up in a census when they're about to enter the land. So not only did she live from the time of when her grandfather Jacob was still alive, but she made it all the way through Joseph, and she made it all the way to Moses, and she made it all the way through the 40 years wandering in the desert, and then she shows up in another census a whole long time later. Well, she was there. She actually knew where her uncle Joseph was buried, and that there was a song, and she knew the song. And she taught the song to everyone that would listen to her. You got to imagine, by the time that they left Egypt, she was a crazy old lady, right? The sharing of that song, the idea of the immortal aspect of cultural heritage and legacy is found in memory, not the memory of what actually happened. I mean, like, people like me who spent a lot of time studying Talmud and for some reason know the Jewish laws on how many days you have to wait until your roots are considered to be firmly planted in the ground and then can take your taxes. And who wants to know that information? It's not relevant anymore, right? But it becomes an immortal legacy because we don't let it stay in its sarcophagus. We don't let it stay concealed under the Nile River. We take it with us, and and we transform it, and we evolve it, we let it grow, and that fruit produces new life. And so Tu B'Shvat, to me, is not just this weird day anymore, but has become a quintessential part of Jewish culture, not just because of Madonna, but because this is what we do, and why we continue to reinvent our culture again and again. Tu B'Shvat, to me, presents that more than any other. I think there's a little bit of time for some questions, if folks have any. Has anyone ever done a Tu B'Shvat Seder? It's very cool. And I would recommend the organization Hazon, Hazon. Hazon is the largest Jewish environmental organization in the world. Has a really nice Haggadah for Tu B'Shvat that is a really good mix of both borrowing from the mystical tradition, but not losing it as a contemporary, relevant piece. And you can download that. Any questions about Tu B'Shvat or any of the other things that have been mentioned? I know it was a lot.
Or anything else? You've got an encyclopedia of Judaism here.
Literally.
How do you
Fabulous.
pronounce it again?
Safaria.
No.
Tu
I have an Orthodox son. I have to be able to pronounce it.
Tu B'Shvat.
To be.
So Tu, 15, B, in, or of, Shvat is the name of the month. So Tu B'Shvat, 15th of Shvat.
That's fantastic.
Thank you. Any questions? Yeah?
If it's so important, why isn't there more information about Jewish art?
So when I say it's important, what I mean is it's not at all. It's literally an irrelevant day in our calendar that we have struggled in the last 100 years to make relevant. I think it's an important symbol of how we adapt and evolve the wisdom of our ancestors, right? So why does Tu B'Shvat, from the perspective of the tax calendar, why does that happen now is actually an ecological reason. That this is the time of year that the roots begin to warm up, and actually in places that have frozen soil will actually thaw the soil around the roots, and it begins to take in its water. So the sap that is the product of the trees taking in that water is literally rising up into the tree right now, all around us. All of the trees around us right now are waking up from their winter dormancy, and the waters that they take will produce the buds that will produce the fruit that will end up growing in the spring. So there's an actual ecological reason, right? That is not mentioned anywhere in the legal codes about how to give tithes or when to take them. But someone in our ancestry remembered that. They knew that. They had that indigenous knowledge, right? So over time, as we have traveled throughout the world, think about Passover. How many people use hearts of romaine lettuce or celery or endive on your Seder plate in this room? We got one hand in the room because you all use horseradish, which is neither green nor bitter nor an herb. Why do you have horseradish? Because try growing bitter lettuce in Poland in March and April. You can't, but that's what we have. So that's what we use. We don't have tithes anymore. So Tu B'Shvat lay dormant until the 16th century when these mystics thought, oh wow, that imagery of the sap rising up in the tree and producing the fruit of life reminds me a lot of spiritual imagery of divine energy flowing through creation and producing the produce of life. So let's create a meditation that brings those two things together. And what model do we have for how we do that? We already have a somatic ritual of embodiment of spring, where we eat symbolic foods and we tell symbolic stories and we try and imagine ourselves on a figurative level as if we were leaving Egypt. Right? And all of those practices that are built into the Passover Seder are there to get a person participating into that mindset. So when I say it's important, it's not an important thing in the calendar. It's an important symbol of how we keep Judaism alive and relevant, and why it's worth an investment of our hearts, right, to me, I'm not saying that doing Tu B'Shvat is important, but understanding why and how we keep these things alive, to me, feels important. I mean, that's why you all are here, right? Secular community thinking blessings on candles. I'm just going to make fun of you for a second. Right? Like, what is that? That is an adaptation of recognizing there is wisdom in the practice of our ancestors, the wisdom of rest, the wisdom of community, the wisdom of continuity. But the metaphors, the language, the analogy stop working for some of us. Right? And so we recreate it, not in a sense of trying to abandon the past, but to keep the past as part of that lineage. Right? Thank you all.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.